going live and just thinking. And in a second, it'll say you're live. Okay, here we are. Welcome to our Dulcimoon Talk today on the 30th of November. I'm Erin Mae, and I am with the lovely and delightful Karen Ashbrook today. And my computer is echoing. I gotta figure out where it's coming from. So sorry. There's another one. How are there so many of these? Okay, technology is our friend. I think I got all the echoes to stop.
I repeat that quote of yours all the time. Like my husband has totally embraced, he learned that from you. We learned that from you. And it's
Technology is our friend. Technology is our friend. It's still my mantra. I need it every day. Yeah. Yep. So Karen is a hammer dulcimer player and has been doing this a long time and has a very extensive life of music that has taken you all over the world. And so I would like us to start at the beginning, wherever that feels like the right place to you, of how you got into music and the hammer dulcimer. How did you get introduced to this?
sure. So the short music background, which definitely helped my career, even though I may or may not have realized that at the time, I am the youngest of four. Everybody in my family did private piano lessons, and then everybody took a band or orchestra instrument in junior high and high school. And we had to schedule our practice times because we all wanted to practice in the same spot. Even when we weren't doing the piano, we wanted to practice by the piano. And so in my household, there was never any arguments over practicing. It's like, it's what we did. I mean, it
Ah,
never even occurred to me that you wouldn't do it in yours. We also had chores. We had to wash the dishes or set the table, clean the bathrooms, um,
yeah.
so I grew up in that environment. And of course, by the time I was in high school, some of my siblings were out of the house, and I took up French horn, and I was practicing 2 to 3 hours a day. Once I was in high school, I was in the county orchestra. I'm from Rochester, New York. So I went to Eastburn Preparatory School, which the big conservatory has, like many do, a school for non-college students, where you
Mm.
get some theory, you get some ear training. So all the theory I've had came from going to the Eastman Preparatory School. I think I had 2 or 3 ear training classes, and I loved it. Oh my God. I could not believe that if you put music into numbers, you could see the patterns, and then you could
Uh-huh.
duplicate it. You could actually analyze what was going on harmonically, and then you could take a style of music and figure out what makes it tick. I It was mind blowing, absolutely mind blowing for me. But I
I love
also
music
realized that,
theory too, and I think we're in the minority for loving music theory, but it was such an a opening of doors and
yeah,
pathways to creation of music that
it was so
yeah.
much fun. So, but I also realized that there's not a lot of French horn literature. That's one of the things I realized, although I
Mhm.
loved orchestra, absolutely loved the county orchestra as much as any. I mean, playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony inside the orchestra is completely different than listening to it outside. Like stuff is
Um,
happening around you and getting, flipped around. It's really exciting. Oh my gosh. It's like you're in the midst of this amazing thing happening all around you. And you get to be big and, well, I was on a brass instrument, right? So big and strong.
yes.
And that's as great as any music experience I've had before
Mm,
since. But
mhm.
I put enough time in that I knew I wasn't good enough to be a professional on that instrument. I didn't have the
Mhm.
high register. I had a better than average low register, but I didn't have the minimum high register you really needed. So I wasn't looking at going to music conservatory. But in the meantime, this is the origin story everybody hears me tell if they've heard me tell it. My boyfriend played banjo in a string band with 5 brothers. He wasn't one of the brothers, but when I was in high school. Old time. He was clawhammer. I
Nice.
went to all the rehearsals and all the gigs. And after a couple years of doing that, I wanted to get in on the action, but
Uh-huh.
I was too intimidated to play one of the instruments they played. And Sam Herman, some people might know her. She's from West Virginia. I knew Sam. I wasn't in West Virginia, but I'd met her. She had built a hammer dulcimer and she'd never worked with wood before. And she's a wonderful old-timey hammer dulcimer player. One of my favorites still. She was my inspiration. I thought if she can do it, I can do it. And when I was a high school senior, I had to do a year-long project to graduate, which was a reflection of my school. And I didn't want to write a paper because that was too much work.
Because who does?
So I built a hammer dulcimer and I gave a concert on it. And 3 days after I built it, I went out and played the open mic in Golden Link, which was Rochester's Folk Society. I think I played Turkey in the Straw and I forget something else. But, and one advantage I had when I took it up, and in those days, hammer dulcimers did not have marked courses. It was a 1211, and it wasn't a kit. I built it from scratch. It was based
Wow.
on a Sam Rosetta design.
Hmm.
I'd been listening to this music for a few years, so I had the tunes in my head.
Yeah.
It was not new repertoire to me. I mean, I remember picking out Devil's Dream and Liberty, and, if I didn't get it quite right, I had friends who were going to tell me that. But it wasn't like, our students who are just getting introduced into this kind of music.
Yeah, right.
And it's a lot harder for them because they don't have it already in their head.
Hmm.
And then as one does in the old-timey music scene, I learned some clawhammer banjo and I learned a little bit of mandolin and I learned very basic guitar so I could follow the guitar player's chords. I knew my
Yeah,
two
that's a
finger
good trick.
chords on mandolin, right? I wasn't any good, but I could do it, right? So
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
um and the real but then after I built it, this is the sad part of the story. This is like in Molly Malone when she dies, right? There's this sad moment in this story. So I build it, I'm all excited, I'm tuning it like crazy, and I find out that it's not an old-timey instrument. And old-timey musicians did not want hammer dulcimers.
Oh.
I mean, Sam and Joe Herman were great, but in generally, and I'm from a real hotbed of old-timey music in upstate New York. The Highwood String Band were close by, and there are a bunch of really brilliant young musicians trekking down to Galax, Virginia, and
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
Tommy Jarrell and all these. And hammer dulcimer was not part of those traditions. So
Mhm.
when I was in junior high, we had a substitute music teacher one time who played a Chieftains record. And I fell absolutely in love with Irish music. I heard the Chieftains live in Rochester. Now, Rochester at that time did not have an Irish music scene to speak of. Um, Derek Bell, the harp player, was playing hammer dulcimer a little bit I mean, I think Chieftains 3 is Rights of Man. I retuned my dulcimer so I could have a low E like him. Um, it's not an Irish instrument either, but I didn't know that because the chieftains presented it as if it was. So here I am going down another rabbit hole where ultimately I'm not really going to be welcomed, but I didn't know that, right? So young I mean, there's a lot to be said
Uh-huh.
for being young and cute and enthusiastic. It takes you a long way.
That was how my experience with playing mountain dulcimer and bluegrass is. It was the only kind of music around. Nobody wanted to have a mountain dulcimer in the bluegrass jam, but they were kind of willing to let me try.
So, I had some music buddies and I learned off of albums, of which there weren't very many, but there were a few. The year I graduated from high school, we went to the National Folk Festival, which was in DC that year. And it happened to also align with when the Smithsonian Folklife Festival was, and Mick
Oh,
Maloney
nice.
was doing his Green Fields of America. And it was the first time where I ran into a record seller that sold like Irish music. I mean, labels from Ireland. And so I bought an album. I didn't know anything about it. And I took it back. So we're back at home. We've had this fun trip and we're sitting around the living room of the five brothers of the band, the Henry brothers. And we put on the album and people talk about remembering exactly where they were when something happened.
Mm-hmm.
I remember exactly where I was when I heard the opening guitar on the first Bothy Band album, and Michael O'Donnell is going da 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 on a DADGAD guitar. Nobody had heard
Uh-huh.
that sound before. Oh man, I was so hooked, so hooked. So, anyway, I had to leave. I had to leave Rochester to get Irish music. It was the day, and this dates me, but in the 70s, in the mid 70s, the first of one of the budget airlines started up, Freddie Laker, and you could buy one-way tickets to Europe that were very cheap.
Mm.
And I saved up my money, worked for, a year, and I went overseas on a one-way ticket to England. I was going to go to Ireland. I eventually got there, but I ended up spending a lot more time in England on that trip. And I thought, I'll start busking. I'll do some street music.
Mm-hmm.
um, and see how long my money lasts. Well, it never ran out. And basically, I
Wow.
spent 5 years overseas, two, three, and I mean, I went around the world this way, and then I went around the world that way. I was based in England when I was in Europe, but 2 years in Europe, 3 years in Asia. I went overland to India because I lost a coin toss with my boyfriend. It's like Ireland, India, flip, heads or tails. Oh, India it is. And after 2 weeks after we went through Iraq, this is the 70s, right? I'm a child of the 70s. 2 weeks after we went through Iran, the Shah was kicked out and the overland route closed, which is
Mm.
how I ended up spending a lot more time in Asia. So that's kind of
Wow.
in a nutshell. And I eventually got back to the States and I eventually ended up in the DC area because of the Irish music scene here, which is very good, DC and Baltimore. And there was
Uh-huh.
a folk music store where I could work, and there was a harp player I could be in a band with, Sue Richards. And so I ended up here.
Wow. You're telling this story, and I'm thinking, oh, that's my dream life.
Well, um, in Ireland in those days, although no one had seen a hammer dulcimer, it wasn't an issue. They were really, really welcoming to me.
Hmm.
It's only really been an issue in the US.
How
It's not,
interesting.
it isn't an Irish. They've had them in Ireland
Hmm.
for at least 3 centuries, but it never caught on as a whole tradition. So you had,
Hmm.
just a handful of
Hmm.
people playing them and building
Hmm.
them. In Scotland, it was a tradition. In England, it was a tradition, but it never, in fact, there's actually quite a few newspaper and reports of there was a Jewish hammer dulcimer player who lived in Dublin and did all the social popular parties in 17 something or other, 1756 or something. And we have some of
Wow.
his set lists. So we know it's been there.
Uh-huh.
But yeah. So
Sort
I'm
of
just kind of a
underground.
misfit who followed my nose for Irish music.
Yeah. So how did you end up making music your career,
Well,
building a
it certainly
business with
wasn't the
it?
plan. I mean, I didn't have a plan except I wanted to play Irish music. I
I
mean,
love it.
I built the hammer dulcimer to play old-timey music for sure. But when I
Uh-huh.
found out I wasn't really welcome there, I kind of moved to Irish music. And I did both for years. I mean, I was in
Mm.
square dance bands and when I moved to the
Mhm.
DC area, I was in a country dance band until about 7 years ago, I stopped playing for dances because of arm issues. But I love playing. I built the dulcimer as a conduit of playing music with other people and in
Yeah.
specifically dance music. It's always
Uh-huh.
very
I'm
driven by
super
rhythm.
drawn to that too.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, but as I said, I started busking and then I never spent any money. And when I moved, I had a couple times I had other jobs, but never for more than about 6 months or 8 months. Otherwise,
Mhm.
I just, when I came back to the States, the Hammer Dulcimer had started to get established there. And in Tacoma Park, where I moved in the Washington, D.C. area, there was a folk music store there that sold and rented them. So I was the teacher when I moved here.
Nice.
And I had a brief period in Chicago, Evanston, and Evanston had a folk music store, Hogwarts, not Hogwarts, Hog Eye. That's it. And so I started teaching some lessons there. And I worked in the store in Tacoma Park for a long time. And then I just, you go along. I had a son, he played harp. I had a couple of students. Most of my students have been adults. They haven't been
Mhm.
children. But I
Mhm.
had a couple of kids and I had my son who were really talented. And I was inspired to start running children's Irish music sessions so that they had peers to play with and a reason to work on
Yeah.
repertoire.
Yeah.
And I ran a monthly Irish children's session and did a little tune booklet for them for 9 years. And I also ran a summer camp because I realized the kids didn't know anything about Irish culture. So my summer camp allowed me to teach them some about the culture, and they all had to learn whistle and they all had to learn bowron. We used pizza boxes, in
Yes.
addition to whatever their instrument was.
Uh-huh.
It was mixed instruments. So I did that for 19 years. Yeah. And the tune booklet I put together is free on my website. If you go to the lessons page on my website, it's Irish. I called it the Sligo Creek Hedge School, was my hedge schools were the unofficial schools in Ireland for the Catholics during the penal years when Catholics weren't allowed to be educated and they weren't allowed to speak the Irish language. But if you've ever been in Ireland, and I know you have, there's these roads with these hedges and sort of behind the hedges. So I called it a hedge school, and I live by Sligo Creek. So that was
Oh,
kind of a natural name.
I love it. I know I have appreciated that collection of music. I looked through it a great deal when we were doing the Corn Tune Irish session that happened a couple of
Oh, yeah.
times. I helped kind of create the Mountain Dulcimer tablature, and a lot of it was based on the transcriptions from your
Nice.
collection. Yeah,
I'm thrilled that
really
people
useful.
find it and still use it. I think that's fantastic.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yay. Yeah, because a great collection of tunes is a great collection of tunes, and that's that. It doesn't ever lose its value in our community because it's tunes that we all want to keep
And the
passing
thing
along.
is, there's no shortage of tunes, right? The problem
Hmm.
is you buy O'Neill's or you go to the session.org. There are 2,000 tunes. What do you learn? So
I know.
the smaller collections are nice. And I put
Yes.
some chords and my husband doesn't always agree with the chords. And now I don't always agree with the chords, but it's a starting place for people.
Right, right. When I was in Scotland this summer, I found myself really disoriented because as a bluegrass primarily player, you start with the chord progression and then it'll be set the entire time, and then everything else is improvised around the chord progression. And I got to Scotland and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna get the chord progression in my mind. And then I was like, they changed it. They changed it again. They changed it yet again. What am I
Yeah.
doing? I'm
There's
so
there's no
lost.
standard there's no standard chord progression. And part of the reason for that, I mean, first of all, Irish and Scottish music are melody traditions. People play the
Yeah.
melody. They don't improve. I mean, they vary it, but it's recognizably the melody.
And the improvisation seems to be in the embellishments, not the tune
A lot of
itself.
it is, yeah.
Mhm.
But the thing is, at least with Irish music, it's not quite as true as Scottish. It's the melodies are quite heavily pentatonic. They're not based on triads. So, in old-timey music, it's pretty clear 1, 4, 5. I mean, sometimes you have a four
Yeah.
chord or a 5, 7 chord, but it's pretty clear cut where you would change chords, what you would go to. When you're dealing with pentatonic melodies, there's a lot of obvious places to change the chord and obvious chords to play, or no obvious chords and no obvious place. It's
Yes.
drone-based music. It's not traditionally harmonized. So
Mm-hmm.
the the attitude in most Irish sessions is you only have one guitar player playing at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Because however many guitar players you have, you'll have that many chord
Different
progressions
chords.
happening at
Yeah,
the same
right.
time. Same goes
Uh-huh.
with the harp. You have to, you know, so
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot more challenging than getting in on old time and bluegrass, definitely.
Yeah, if you start with chords, it definitely is. Yep. Yeah. So you were telling me a little bit before we started actually recording about the Cimbalom World Congress and
Yeah.
some of the other kind of international experiences you've had. W- I don't know much about the Cimbalom World Congress, so tell me about that.
Yeah. So let's see. I'm trying to think when it started. I think I was living in Maryland when it started because I remember getting a notice in the store I was working in. But I think the
Okay.
first one I attended was 2007. It started in the 1990s and it was started out of Hungary. So the cymbalum is the Hungarian hammer dulcimer. It's a very big, heavy instrument. They have cast iron frames. They weigh over 100 pounds. And
Whoa, you don't move those, huh?
no, not easily. No, no, they're
Wow.
very heavy. And in what I was surprised when I started going to the Congress, and every 2 years it meets in a different country, um, was that in most countries, with the exception of the US and England, like in all the other countries, it is taught in conservatory. And it is both a classical and a folk instrument. So, you know, I consider the Americans the comic relief of the Congress. We're the buffoons. We don't, it's like we don't know what we're doing. They're all, conservatory, and they've been playing since they were yay high and drilling their tremolos and all kinds of good stuff like that. But the nice thing about the Congress is that they have a healthy respect for traditional music and folk music. So they don't make you feel lesser if you're not, but it's definitely an academic leaning Congress. And so there are a lot of European countries, the Eastern European countries and Germany have conservatories. And then, of course, Persia, Iran, where it probably originated, has a very unbroken tradition. And then it went along the Silk Road, but it did that later. It didn't do that in the beginning. But all the Asian countries connected by land have a version of it. But it's a later instrument. But it's factory produced in China and Taiwan now. So it never made it to the Philippines, never made it to Japan in terms of a music tradition. But there are a lot of conservatories in China teaching Yangqing, the Chinese version. And actually, when the last Congress that was in China, it's been in China twice. It was in 2019 in Hefei, which is southern China, in Anhui province. And I was at that, and there were over 800 people attending. There were 12 non-Asians at that particular Congress, of which I was one. It's partly because they were very late organizing where it was, because it was originally going to be in Beijing, and then there was an issue with that, and then they didn't decide until the last minute where it was going to be. And it's for non-Asians, it takes time to get a Chinese visa. So they were just a handful. But next year it's going to be in Korea, and I'm expecting more Europeans to go when it's in Korea. So yeah. But anyway, I started going, and I've made all of them since I started going. They would love for us to do it in America, but the organization doesn't really give you any support. But they want it to be, it's very inexpensive to attend. Nobody's paid to be there. Everybody pays to attend. It's sort of like Everett, Michigan, the big hammer dulcimer thing where
Uh-huh.
everybody pays to attend.
Uh-huh.
It's ridiculously affordable. They arrange subsidized housing, but the organization itself doesn't support you. But it's a place to meet other people and other dulcimers. And we even, when we started going, the Americans got people jamming. And the Austrian youth really, I mean, the danger is to start a 12-bar blues and then, just go away for an hour and the kids will still be playing that. It's they take off with a 12-bar blues, but yeah. Great fun.
I love that. I love that. It is interesting because I talked to Carmen a bit about um, her experience with the hammer dulcimer, and it was very formal and organized, and you play your part. And our tradition with it is not that.
Yes, very German. Because of my travels, I've sort of been in the right place at the right time to help spark some stuff. So when I lived in Japan, one of the great things about doing street music is you meet the local musicians. Like, who is
Mhm.
on the street in the middle of the day but other flaky musicians, right? So
Creative artsy people
in
and
Japan,
tourists.
I did very well busking and with my boyfriend, and we met the tiny catter of people who at that time, and this was in 79, were playing Appalachian old-timey music, actually playing old, and they were learning from records the way I'd learned Irish music. We met those
Uh-huh.
folks and got in with them, and there were some people in that crowd who were interested in hammer dulcimer. No one had one yet, and that trip and the next time I was in Japan, I went back a year later. I bought Yang Chins in the department store in Hong Kong, Kowloon actually, where they were very inexpensive. And there are two tuning systems in the Chinese dulcimer. So the conservatory players use a system that's different than ours. But at that time, they also had a lot of dulcimers with fifth tuning, like the US
Okay.
system. So I
Hmm.
was on my two trips to Japan, I picked up a Chinese dulcimer, took it to Japan, and then I sold it before I left. And that got dulcimers into the hands of a couple people. And then, and actually, the one of the biggest teachers there now, who's in Sapporo, he saw me playing at the Takarazuka Bluegrass Festival in, I think it was in 81. And that's why he took up hammer dulcimer, apparently. But come back to the States. I'm living here, and there's this wonderful player, maybe you know him, Dave Neiman, from Cambridge. And he was a busker too. And I was saying, David, you should go to Japan. They've got great busking there. Like we always did really well. And he started going to Japan, and he's the one that started importing real dulcimers. He got Dusty Strings dulcimers over here. So he started giving lessons. I never gave lessons. I sort of got the ball rolling and just
Hmm.
encouraged, and he took it and ran with it. And for several
That's
years, he
cool.
was going over there. And that's when the hammer dulcimer scene there really started to happen. They come to the
Mm.
Congress. There's also a Cimbalom group. There's a Cimbalom group in Tokyo that's wonderful. And then there are people who play hammer dulcimer. And most of the people who play American hammer dulcimers are playing Irish. A lot of them are playing Irish music among
Hmm.
their
Hmm.
repertoire. And initially they were all on Dusty Strings. Now there are other instruments getting over there too. But
Wow.
so that started that. And then
Yeah.
I helped with the revival in Belgium. In Belgium, there had been a tradition, like most of Europe, and the last Belgian hammer dulcimer player died in 1870 something. I mean, there's a name, there's who he was. And when my husband and I first got married, my husband's Belgian, Flemish, he was visiting a sort of a private folk music museum, and there were a lot of hakkebord, chopping boards. Hakkebord is the Flemish name. And the person whose collection it was, Herman de Witt, happened to be there. And Paul, my husband, said, "Oh, my wife plays and teaches that." And it was like, really? And they had just started, they have a Flemish folk music camp every summer. And they had just started a year or two before bringing over people from England and building. They had a building week. And then Roger
Okay.
Froude helped with that. who passed away last year. But Roger Frood really helped with because they figured people have to get instruments.
Right.
And then at the time, Roger was married to Braun, to his wife at the time came over and taught people. So I happened to start going over. I think it was the third year they offered it. So people had instruments. And I didn't go over every year, but I've been there several, I've taught several times at that camp. And I made a instruction DVD that's it's in English, but it has overdubs in Flemish and French as well. And the type is all in
Uh-huh.
3 languages, very Belgian.
It is, yes. I spent all of 3 days in Belgium this year, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of languages here.
And they have a mountain dulcimer tradition there. I mean, that's
Yeah.
very active Hummel. I mean, it's not the American hammer dulcimer, mountain dulcimer, but it's a drone-based instrument. So you typically only have
Mhm.
frets on the melody string.
Mhm. Mhm.
But Paul's got one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it seems like there's I when I was kind of looking for all of the mountain dulcimer family instruments, and they would call it a hummel in one place, and they would call it an epinet in another place, and they would call it, and sometimes they were all exactly the same, and they would put a different name on it, and sometimes there would be different like different
Well,
tuning configurations
yes,
in terms of whether the drones went low to high or high to low or how many there
right. The
were,
direction
and they
they
would use
strum
the
in.
same name for different configurations, but then the same configuration would have two names depending on the region. So as far
Yeah.
as I could tell, there was not any kind of a strict this name is associated with this exact
Well,
setup of the instrument.
yeah,
It's
that's
more like
probably true. I
what we
mean,
call it around here.
Epinet is the French name. Hummel is the Flemish name. But having said that, there are, and just like in our country, the builders have experimented with design.
Yeah,
So you
sure.
get some people who've done things that are a bit more chromatic, ways of
Mhm.
doing chromatic. And on
Mhm.
Paul's Hummel, he has two melody strings. The outside string is diatonic, and the string just on the inside is fretted with every half step, so he can reach in. So one of the things,
Uh-huh.
the bagpipes work the same way. You can't change the drones on a bagpipe, but
Right.
tunes will go from major to the parallel minor. They've got so it'll go from G major and then it'll have a part that's in G minor, which is horrible on an American hammer dulcimer. Three
Yes.
flats away, right? I go from one sharp to two flats. It's like, oh my, but that's their Hummels and their bagpipes work that way that they can
Yeah.
do that.
And it was looking at how they developed the chromatic things on those instruments that made me for the first time actually understand the harmonic minor scale, because the harmonic minor scale made so much sense when I looked at it through that lens.
And you could see
Whereas
the half steps.
if I looked at it through the lens of the diatonic instrument that I'm used to playing, it didn't make any sense at all how we got
No,
there.
it's
But
not a diatonic scale. You
it's
have a
not a
step and a half
diatonic
interval between
scale.
minor six and major seven.
But if
Yeah.
you start your scale on the third fret and you've got that half
Half step.
step below, right there on the on the regular melody string,
Right.
and then you catch that chromatic minor third across, it's way easier to play that major seventh, which you hear in the
Yeah.
harmonic minor scale, than
Cool.
the yeah, I it was
Very
that was a
cool.
nerdy moment for me.
Yay! Isn't that fun?
It is so fun. I love the music theory nerd moments, and just the tiny reframing that sometimes makes all of music
So
look
you know what
different.
the Hummel players do over there when they're playing for a dance? Well, one thing they do is they put their instruments on a table to act for resonance. But the other thing
Uh-huh.
is they show up with two or three instruments for being in different keys. They don't
And
use
they
a
just switch them
capo, they
out.
don't
Yeah.
retune. They have like the one that's in G and the one that's in C, and they actually
Uh-huh.
just switch switch their instruments so that they don't have all this downtime.
I think it was Franz who was telling me that sometimes, even instead of putting it on a table, if the barn had a loft, they would put it on the floor of the loft. And then the whole loft floor would be the sounding board
That makes
resonating.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, so fascinating. Ah, I love it. Okay, so I have two more questions in my mind.
Okay.
One is we are all about highlighting women who have inspired us and women who are inspirations. And it's clear that you are a woman who has inspired a lot of people to play this instrument. And you named right at the beginning Sam
Who's
Herman,
my
who
inspiration?
inspired
Who's a woman,
you.
right? People don't,
Yeah.
yeah, they
Are
don't
there
know her.
other women along the way that you were particularly inspired or encouraged by?
Well, for hammer dulcimer, because I took it up so long ago, there
Mm-hmm.
weren't, I mean, actually, in Rochester, when I took it up, there were two other people who played, and they were both women. One was Mitzi Collins, and the other, I forget the name of the other person, Joyce, who was in Kaylee band, actually. But I didn't drive. They weren't teaching. They did not live near me. So
Mm-hmm.
they were people I knew that played, but I actually didn't really rub elbows with them at all. But everybody from that time period taught themselves. There weren't books.
Yeah.
The only time you saw other musicians was at festivals. And we all sounded different because we were all self-taught. And
Yep.
it's a very inefficient way to learn the instrument. Like, I do not recommend. I mean, it took me 7 years to think about doing rolled chords because it just didn't occur to me. I can
Uh-huh.
teach that in 3 minutes. It's like,
Uh-huh.
and also once they started marking the courses on hammer dulcimer, so you have these patterns, there was
Yeah.
no going back for me. But the dulcimer I started with, in those days, dulcimers did not have marked courses. That was a
When did
Sam
the
Rosetta
marked
change.
courses come in? What era was that?
Well, it was a Sam Rosetta design.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Nick Blanton, I think he said he started doing it in the 70s, but when I saw him was in the mid 80s. And I remember seeing Dusty Strings dulcimers had them. And I got a Dusty String after I came back from Asia. I left the one I built in England. It's my European dulcimer. And I got a Dusty Strings, which I loved, and I played that for a long time until I started playing Nick Blanton instruments. But that was the first time I'd seen that. I didn't, you know, I don't know if I was aware of the patterns. I mean, I just didn't think of it that
You
way,
just
right?
memorized where the notes were?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it was a 12-11 too, and I tuned it a bit differently. I had some as one does when you don't have many notes, you tweak the tuning to facilitate the kind of music you're playing.
Sure.
Now we have instruments that have a lot of notes that are still relatively light and small, so we don't need to make as many sacrifices. But even now, I got two new instruments from Nick, a lightweight one and a concert one a couple years ago, and I tweaked the tuning a little bit to, squeeze in an extra note. I sacrificed a note that I use, but not very much, to get an extra bass note, and those kinds of to get a
Mm-hmm.
D2 and an
Mm-hmm.
E2. I gave up a C sharp, but
Uh-huh.
it's so
Yeah.
people are always still even now tweaking it. Well, yeah, you can see people tweak all the time, like Joshua Messick and Ruth Smith working with Russell Cook with Masterworks and Mark Allen White.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even now, I think a lot of players still work with builders to tweak, but I've always worked with Nick, and Nick worked very closely with Sam, and they designed the instruments together. So
Okay. Yeah. I have only known hammer dulcimers with marked bridges, so it's hard for me to imagine how you would orient to it without that.
not
But
as
if
many
you don't
strings.
have it, you just do it, right?
That's right.
Uh-huh.
That's right. Yeah, I don't know. I was young. I didn't think about these things, Erin. You don't question when you're young, you don't question, right?
Yeah, and if you're not trying to teach it, you don't need to learn how to communicate it. It does
Right.
feel like a whole different level of understanding is needed to teach something than to just figure out how to play a song.
Yeah. And when I first started teaching, well, I started in Chicago, but really I started teaching when I moved to the DC area. I was not an experienced teacher for this instrument, for hammer dulcimer, but I was young and enthusiastic and cute. And I think I think the thing that surprised me that took, I mean, I certainly had come through classical lessons, so I had a concept
Mhm.
of teaching scales and
Mhm.
technique, but
Mhm.
the hammer dulcimer was really easy for me, the basics. And what I discovered when I started teaching is it's not really easy for everybody.
Mhm.
You know, and I had the advantage, as I said, of listening to the music a lot before I tried to start picking it out by ear.
Yeah.
And I had the advantage of, I mean, I didn't in those days I didn't read on dulcimer, read music on, I mean, because it was oral traditions I was playing, but that
Mhm.
didn't phase me. And I started getting students who'd only ever read music. And the thought of trying to learn by ear was just, you know, terrifying. They said they couldn't do it. I mean, adults have we're our own worst enemies when we're learning something new a lot of times.
Yeah. We
We
are
think we
so
can't
much
do it because
less
we haven't
patient
done it.
with ourselves when we're an adult trying to learn a thing than kids are. Kids just know
Yeah,
what's going
well,
to
we
go
make
along
these
fine.
decisions that we can't do it because we haven't done it.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
and my thing I've always said is if you're reading music, there's nothing in the music that's actually making you play what's on the page. It's your ear telling you that you're playing what's on the page. So even if you're
Mhm.
reading music, you are still using your ear. You
Mhm.
have to be. You
Mhm.
know, the notes do not control your fingers. It's,
Yeah.
but yeah. So, you know,
Yeah.
it took, and then of course, teaching group is really different than teaching privately too. And that
Yeah.
took some time to get used to.
Mhm.
So, you know, I kind of limped along, but I got better. It was a long time
Yeah.
ago. So last century.
Okay, well, I want to wrap up by just giving you a chance to talk about where you're at now, the projects that you're doing now, because you have some really beautiful things that you
Thank you.
do both online and in person in your now life.
So there are two things in my now life. The biggest thing is 10 years ago, I took training from the Music for Healing and Transition program, MHTP, to become a therapeutic musician. And my exposure to that program came from Kentucky Music Week and some of my students who told me about it. And I went straight home and applied and never looked back. And that's, you know, I stopped teaching my children's Irish music camps when my hospital work really took off. So right now I'm working 2 days a week at Georgetown in DC. I worked at Walter Reed Medical Hospital for several years, but my grant ran out there. And you know, when I got into this kind of music, part of my mission, it's like I found my purpose in life, and I felt like my
Yeah.
whole life had been training to come do this and
Mm,
to inspire other musicians to consider using their music for healing and wellness.
mhm.
And, you know, everywhere I go, I talk about it a lot because, and there's a lot of room in the inn for different levels of playing for people.
Yeah.
If you're going to play, do one-on-one, you really should get certified, which is different than being a music therapist. It's a very doable
Mm,
certification. But, and
mm,
I thought when I got into it, I didn't think the music side would be particularly satisfying because it's slow and it's
mhm.
soft and it's not complex. But actually, my musical vocabulary has just expanded and exploded because I've learned more kinds of music, a lot more kinds of music. So my harmony vocabulary and understanding has really broadened.
Mm,
Stuff I would never want to do in concert, but the bar in the hospital's really low. I mean, if people recognize it, they are so happy. So now I do
yeah.
some Beatles and Disney and Broadway and not a lot of pop, but some, you know, so I've continued to
Mm,
grow. It's allowed me to grow as a musician. It's allowed me to work with an aging body where fast and loud I can't do anymore, or I can't do for any length of time. So
mhm.
and it's the most uplifting work in the world for me. I mean, it's incredible to see the power of music in action. you're with people in some of their most vulnerable, delicate, sacred times of life.
Yeah.
And also the hospital workers are like the warriors in the trenches, and they're so much fun. Oh my God, they're so great. They're just so happy to have the music. The smile, you're just showered with smiles and goodwill, and you help people cry and all that. So that's great. So that's the big thing. But pandemic happened, right? And all that went away. I was like, I lost 80% of my income. Boom, March 13th, 2020. Very
Uh-huh.
exciting.
Yeah.
But then, quarantines came along and the world went online. And
Yeah.
I feel like now I have a more balanced life.
Mm.
I was doing a little bit too much therapeutic music work before. I was getting a little burned out. And
Okay.
now my life is more balanced and I love teaching online. I mean, I love teaching in person, but I don't mind being online. I
Me
don't mind
too.
performing online. I actually
There are a
have
lot of
fun.
things about adult learning that I think our students are just way more comfortable in their own houses behind that screen. Like in some ways, those like inner dialogue, inner critic voices that haunt us so much as adults when we're trying to do that new thing. Some of them
Yeah.
are just quieter when
Yeah. So
you've
that's
got
that's
sort of a
been
layer.
really fun. And Steven Seifert, God bless him, started talking to me a few years about you should really do a subscription site. I'm like, anyway, he talked me into it. Let's just say he was heavily influential, which meant he had to spend a lot of time with me on the phone. And I didn't use his platform in the end, but a year and a half ago, I started a subscription site, Dulcimer with Heart, which is what my little
Yes, yes. I
reverse.
love it. I love
Um,
it.
and one of the things we do is and this again, because Stephen told me, he said, you've got to involve Paul. So once a month, we run a jam session with Paul. And I don't focus on old timey music. And I actually don't even focus on Irish, although we do it because Irish is hard for people. So we do a lot of European music, a lot of 1 and 5 stuff with easy chords. And
Yeah.
we start slow and speed up. And I'm really trying to get people to just practice their chords because that is at the heart of getting fluent on a hammer dulcimer is chords, knowing your chords, learning to hear changes, learning to move your hands in rhythm. And I give a new tune every month, like probably everybody does. And I have preloaded lessons beyond that. But it's going, it's growing. I I'm doing it for now. It's a lot of fun. The people are great. It's growing. I wish it was bigger, but
Mhm.
I'm trying, but that's pandemic. It's such a gift. This year I've had some times where I was sick or you get COVID. I can still teach from home. We
Yeah.
ran a jam session this summer when we both had COVID. I had a temperature and
Oh
Paul
my
had just gotten
goodness.
over his temperature. And we were kind of spacey, but we couldn't have done that before.
Yeah,
So that's
right.
that's very awesome.
Mhm.
So, and I have students in person again, which is real. I mean, there's going to camps in person. There's nothing like being with people.
Mhm.
And you
Mhm.
have amazing conversations, inspirational. You get to know people when you're in person in a way that just isn't going to happen online,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
But online, we get to connect with people all over the world and in different time zones and
Right. There are definitely
people who
people
can't.
that I've made connections with because of the online space that I never would have had the opportunity to connect with outside of
Yeah.
that. And yeah, it's and both, I think.
Yeah, like you and DJ with Dulcimoon. Like
Yes.
it's your
Yes.
wet. Well, you're not where near DJ is, but
We are
we're in
nowhere near
great
each
parts of the
other.
country.
Yes. Yeah, it's really true. And we had met in person, but we would not have had the opportunity to work together so closely had it not been for everything being online. And yeah, it's really
So I
special.
love that. I feel very
I do too.
grateful.
I do
And
too.
Dulcimoon is creating and crafting your own unique way of running your virtual festival to put your own brand on it and give, it's quite different than, very different than corn tunes from what you've told me.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of which, our registration for Dulcimoon should be going live for the 2024 festival tomorrow. We are this close to going live with that, so there will be a big announcements on all the social media places and emails going out as soon as that is live. And we can announce that you're the 2025 featured Hammer Dulcimer
2025,
player.
yeah. So I got to be there in 2025, but tell us, who are the 2024 teachers?
So the headliners are Katie Moritz for Hammer
Yay.
Dulcimer and Elaine Conger for Mountain Dulcimer.
Oh
And
man.
then we have a whole group of support ladies, all women teaching from apps and technology side to the instruments themselves. And so I think it's going to be really special, and it is really community focused. We didn't want it to just be about come in and take a class. We wanted it to be about that sense of community and being together and getting to know each other, and a lot of things to try to cultivate creativity and creative practices in your daily lives as you go out from the festival itself. So um
It's
yeah.
interesting what you're saying about community. I know we're going long, but when I picked my platform, one of the reasons I picked the platform I did was because it had a community aspect. I set up threads. It hasn't been used a lot, but where people could interact with each other.
Yeah.
And we do a hangout once a month where, we're just, I wanted it to be a sense of community and not just people
Yeah. I think it's really
destroyed.
important in a world where people are feeling more and more lonely according to all the data and research. I feel like the Dulcimer community is sort of this magical place where we we aren't all alone. We're all finding ways of connecting with each other, and the instrument is something that helps us, I don't initiate that connection in a really powerful way that I think is really beautiful.
We need that time together. I mean, that's what music
Yeah.
does. It lets people be together very deeply and intimately and joyfully, even if they have
Mhm.
really different worldviews. And we need to
Yeah,
experience people as people on that human level, which
I
sometimes
agree.
other things get in the way. And music
Yeah. Yeah.
really opens up our hearts to each other.
Yes. If we start from music, the rest doesn't seem as important. And then when we have those moments of disagreement, we can see past that to the good, beautiful hearts of the other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ugh. Thank you for
Thank
spending this time
you.
today to
This
share
was
with
really
us.
fun.
It's really fun for me too. I love learning more of your story, and I'm gonna go chase down some of these names that you mentioned that I haven't heard and learn more. And I'm gonna
All
go
right.
check out the World Cimbalom Congress. I don't know if they would let a mountain dulcimer player in, but I'm very
Well, you can
curious.
attend. You won't be on stage, but you can
That's
attend.
fair. I love it. All
Awesome.
right. Thank you so much. Everybody take care out there.
Bye.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
watching.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Yay.